Welcome, everyone. See, the attendees are filing in. We'll get started here in about 30 seconds. All right. Welcome to Crimes and Cocktails, which we'll explain the name of this web series here in a little bit, but hopefully it's got you intrigued. Obviously got to do with some stories that you might want to share over dinner and drinks with some friends. Nothing a little too scary though. So we're sponsored today by cart.com and a couple experts from Signifyd. Well, at least one expert, and then I'm also here. We'll talk to you about how we handle the types of people who want to steal from our retailers and financial institution partners. So have a really good group today of folks that are attending, spanning kind of the e-commerce and retail sectors and financial institution sectors. So we'd love to hear from you all throughout the webinar. If you could type into the question function, and the chat will be open as well for groups that are attending the webinar. We'll try to answer some of the questions, especially the most interesting questions, in the webinar itself, and then we'll also follow up afterwards if you have questions that we don't have a chance to get to. So please use that functionality within the Zoom interface, and we love to answer some of your questions. So I am Bennett, just go by my surname, anonymous, but have to have a J there for some systems records. So, but I go by Bennett, and nice to meet everyone. I'm SVP of Operations and Corporate Development at Signifyd. Most relevantly for today, that means I work with our customers, some of the largest customers in the world, and then mom and pops, on Shopify, BigCommerce, Magento, et cetera. So love working with the Walmarts of the world and them and kind of everybody in between, selling physical stuff, digital stuff, subscriptions, all that type of stuff. And on my team, one of the subject matter experts is Doug. So Doug, can you introduce yourself for the webinar, please?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Doug Agurkis, like Bennett said. I'm the Senior Manager of Chargeback Operations here at Signifyd. I've been doing chargeback management for over the past 10 years now. I started off at Amazon as their chargeback manager, moved over to Microsoft as their global chargeback manager for the past 8 years, thought about how can I expand kind of the impact that I have in chargeback knowledge across multiple merchants. That's what got me here at Signifyd, and definitely am enjoying that challenge.
Awesome. Yes, we're very lucky to have Doug. And so folks, if you have questions, either about kind of like the history of chargebacks or kind of what Signifyd does, we're going to cover those today. But feel free to direct questions to me or to Doug or to kind of anyone else in the group. We'll also be running some polls. So, when we come to the poll section, please make sure that you participate. Really makes things a little bit more helpful and engaging. And then we can talk about people's different experiences. So, we already met us. We're going to go through kind of Chargebacks 101. When in a prior series of Crimes and Cocktails, we talked a little bit about stopping fraudulent behavior. And, we talked about, hey, should we talk about the business model of fraudsters or maybe, some other type of problem in terms of Crimes and Cocktails. And by far the winning kind of piece was, hey, let's just talk about chargeback basics. And kind of what is a chargeback and how do you respond to a chargeback and how do you tell what is a legitimate chargeback from an illegitimate chargeback? So that's why we're talking about kind of the basics for chargebacks today. Of course, it is recording on October 12th, right? And so, we are right in the thick of holiday preparedness and load tests and making sure that we're scaled up. And, we have an opinion on that based on some market trends that we want to talk about. Then Doug has some really fun, cool stories. This is where Crimes and Cocktails kind of gets its name in terms of, these kind of stories you want to share over the water cooler or over dinner with drinks. And so we'll take through some of the stories where we've successfully disputed and recovered funds from abusers or, professional fraud rings. Then we'll talk a little bit about kind of the technical side of disputes and recoveries and how you can manage that. Then also kind of some learnings for the holiday season. So as I mentioned, we'll have a Q&A and a kind of wrap up. So please go ahead and post your questions in the chat. All right. So pretend like I'm an 8th grader kind of knowledge in terms of chargebacks, and then Doug is kind of like PhD level. So hopefully we'll kind of be able to cover like the broad range of knowledge and kind of this. I think the first thing to understand about chargebacks is that there are lots of different types, and that they at their root come from the type of behavior that the cardholder says happened. This bad thing happened. I am paid with my credit card, bank, Visa, card brand. This wasn't me. I didn't try to buy this. That would be what would result in a fraudulent type chargeback. It's also called an unauth or a fraud. In this case, where we're talking about e-commerce, it's called a card not present chargeback. So the difference between a card present and a card not present is important for retailers, because the liability, if you get it wrong for a fraudulent chargeback, sits with you, the retailer, when it's a card not present. If you go in and pay at a kiosk and you use a chip and pin and you actually plug it in or use the RFID, like from that perspective, that technology will make the liability on to the bank, right, from that perspective for fraudulent transactions. And so that's really kind of the core difference of understanding in a card not present, or where in an e-commerce or a phone or an app or a tablet kiosk where there's no human and you're kind of entering in your credit card, any of those type of more arguably modern, right, ways of doing retail are going to result in a fraud chargeback being liable for the retailer. So, Doug, anything else that you want to kind of talk about, fraud chargebacks or kind of that I missed?
No, I mean, you're a little too modest there. I think your expertise in this is showing for sure. I think you covered exactly what I would have said.
Awesome. I appreciate that. Talk tracks, and then the minutia we'll get into. But I think the key thing to understand here, you'll see here on the left of this slide, you have chargebacks are about 60% fraud. That's across all industries, right? And so, Doug, maybe you want to talk a little bit about how that varies based on industry, or like what does it vary by? Maybe is another way to ask that.
Yeah, I think if you look at it, it does definitely vary. If you look at it from a digital goods perspective compared to a physical goods perspective, we'll see merchants in the physical goods space that kind of fit this type of 61% fraud and a large percent item not received. When you get into the digital goods space, I think the fraud moves up even higher towards maybe 75%, and you get less of these item not received or significantly not as described start to go away, just due to the nature of digital goods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then one of my favorite examples to always talk about is if you have things that people want to steal, then you probably have a fraud problem. So maybe if you're selling white labeled cotton swabs, right, or twist ties, right, then you might not have fraud as a reason code kind of in your chargebacks. But in general, if you're making an item and you have something that somebody wants to try to steal, you should have some amount of fraudsters trying to take from you. So the fraud type chargebacks in general, sometimes consumers will lie and claim that they're fraud, and that's what we'll talk about later about how do you weed those out and dispute them. But the majority of your fraud chargebacks are probably going to be actual legitimate fraudsters who have slipped through the systems upstream of should I ship this or not from that perspective. Item not received is another type of claim that a consumer can make. And so that's, it's services not rendered as well in cases of like if you book a massage, right, or that kind of thing, and you actually don't get the massage, or you don't get on the plane because the ticket's not there, or you don't get your, new Samsung Galaxy that was ordered, right? The package got stolen perhaps, or just didn't arrive. And that would be categorized as an item not received. Significantly not as described, commonly, kind of shortened to SNAD, is like, hey, I got the wrong color, or, this blush looks really good on this model, but when I put it on my skin, it causes me to break out. All of those types of things could be like significantly not as described. These two start to really blend in with customer experience, right? So Doug, maybe talk a little bit about those two together, or at least I think of them together, and kind of how do you kind of think about those as different from fraud?
Yeah, definitely. I think that brings up a good point. When we think of chargebacks, we always think fraud. And I would put these into a bucket of, yeah, these are customer disputes, right? The customer is stating, I made this purchase, but I'm unhappy with it. And so for item not received, this one for us, I like these type of chargebacks because the evidence we can provide is really straightforward to prove, no, you did receive this, especially for physical goods. It's just proof of fulfillment and shipment. And then for significantly not as described, obviously this one's a little bit more complicated because we can prove that you bought a specific item and you shipped said specific item, but we can't always prove what was in the box when it was shipped. And so it's really a matter of looking at kind of the policies and procedures each merchant has when it comes to that. But these are definitely, in these scenarios, the customer is claiming, I made this purchase. There's no doubt about it. It's more, I'm just unhappy with it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so I think there can be some customer voice kind of feedback loops, right, that people really want to capture with, hey, if I'm getting a lot of INRs, do I have the right shipping carrier, right? Or is my team meeting their shipping SLAs? Or if I have a lot of SNAD, like, do I have a bad batch of product, or whatever the case may be? So it can actually be very interesting and helpful feedback of, these are your most disgruntled customers, potentially, if it's legitimate, or there are people trying to steal from you. And so then it's either very, very helpful feedback or it's a thief. And so kind of sorting that out can be difficult, but also very helpful. And so the next ones of cancellations typically have to do with things like subscriptions, recurring subscriptions. Hey, Netflix, I canceled in March. You charged me still in April and May. I'm going to go back and cancel. Processing errors typically are things like duplicates, right? Or things that are typically more along with the card brands or the payment services portal or the gateway from that perspective. Anything else that you'd want to talk about in terms of those other big buckets?
No, I mean, that really does kind of sum it up. The processing issues is the third bucket I would see for chargebacks. It's definitely much smaller than the rest. But again, to your point with kind of the customer disputes, it can open you up to realize you have some sort of issue with processing payments, and it's driving chargebacks through authorization issues or duplicates.
All right. So we have some really good questions in that will come to kind of in context. Thanks to the folks who have put some questions in. I think I've made a note of them. Doug, I'm gonna call you out as the expert to help answer these in context of the presentation. But I think that in terms of zooming out a little bit of like, what's the business context, right? Like, I think most people on today are in the business of e-commerce, right? For sure. But like, some people are in fraud, some are in payments, some are in products, some are in customer experience, right? If you abstract this up to a kind of exec level, I think that the things that really matter to a business are the losses that are incurred. They hit your bottom line, right? So it really messes with profitability, these types of chargeback losses, because you're out the good and you're out the payment and you shipped the item to the person, right? So you have all of the COGS and you lose the inventory and then you lose the sale. So it's a very costly, right, to have a chargeback come in. And then if you have too high chargebacks, fraud or non-fraud, like then the card brands can get involved and can really start adding on fees. They'll start dinging you on the top line in terms of your authorization rates. And so it can kind of have a negative flywheel effect. And the last one, and kind of this should be the most universal, is it's a really bad customer experience to have your credit card stolen and used on a site, or to have to file a legitimate chargeback, or to be claim, hey, you're trying to steal from us. We're going to fight that chargeback and try to get the money from you, even though you had a bad customer experience. So you really have to have an accurate decision and the lifetime value of, do we dispute this or not? It's a really hard question that has implications on the loss side, has implications on the customer lifetime value side. And so really, our position is pretty much every stakeholder at an e-commerce business should care for some reason about how this process goes. It's a very important one. All right. So then, in terms of actions that we want to talk about, we want to talk next about kind of the flow. And I think in the flow of this, we can bring up some of the answers to the question. So the kind of start here of our chargeback flow is we ingest information about the order and about the transaction, about the chargeback. And we say, hey, how likely is this to be abusive, right? So we're sorting this is a legitimate complaint. We're probably going to lose this. This is actually bad for the customer. Let's just accept that chargeback and learn from it what we can, versus this consumer is lying, right? And we need to, or this fraudster is lying, and we need to put up some guardrails and some friction to make sure that we don't get taken advantage of. We then enrich that information with third-party data sources, using all kinds of stuff that's available to us and then publicly available in the web. We then feed that information back into our models. Then we go to customized templates. And Doug, I really want you to talk a little bit about this, especially for item not received or non-receipt. That's one of the questions from the chat. And talk about a little bit of how like those can be customized. And then the last piece is once you dispute that with the issuing bank, you're going to have outcomes, right? And so one of those outcomes is going to be, hey, the consumer comes back. And then there's another question, which I think is really interesting one, which is, how often do you see the reason codes change between the first claim and maybe a follow-up claim? And so maybe let's talk a little bit about the templates, Doug, and kind of the outcomes process.
Yeah, that's a great point. So when we look at our templates, we definitely have created templates specific to each card network and reason code. And then even by product type, we're going to have different types of evidence that we're going to provide in those scenarios. I think if we look at item not received, for instance, I think that's going to be pretty standard across all card networks and the reason code specific to INR. But our biggest piece of evidence in that case is going to be that proof of shipment. As long as we can show that this item was shipped specifically to the AVS verified address, it's almost a guaranteed win when you have that level of evidence. Obviously, when you're looking at digital goods, it gets a little bit more complicated because you're not going to have that, signed receipt of delivery, but you're going to have other evidence that shows, history of that item. If it's we're going to get into some examples where we show you what does that exactly look like, but you can show within their account it was emailed, a code was emailed to their email address, or within their digital wallet, you can see it was delivered. So those are alternatives that you can use in INR. But like I said, we're going to have very specialized templates for each reason code because the card networks are very specific on the exact evidence you need to provide. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to be able to tell a story of why we deem this to be an invalid chargeback. And this is going to go to the bank, right? And so we have to say it in words that, banks aren't going to be really knowledgeable in every merchant's policies and processes. And so we really want to tell a story that's understandable, easy to read. They don't have to go through 40 pages to figure out what we're saying. That's clear and concise, but hits everything that the networks are requiring us to provide.
Yep. So I think the next piece in terms of outcomes, right? So sometimes you'll win a chargeback, right? And that means then that the bank will reissue the funds back to the retailer, right? So the consumer, quote unquote, loses in that case. I think in terms of a second chargeback, do you oftentimes see that switching reason codes like, oh, I didn't receive it, I lose, I'm the consumer here, I'm lying, I didn't receive that, and then I lose. And then I'm like, well, you know what? It arrived finally, but it was broken. I actually never made that order. I made a mistake. I did the wrong kind of coding in the drop-down window. Yeah,
I would say it's rare that we see it change for the most part, because you are, when you contact your bank, you have to explain exactly why you're filing a chargeback. Mm-hmm. You're not really supposed to be able to switch your story once you lose, but we do see it where banks have miscategorized it, and then you'll get a reversal and then a second chargeback with a new reason code. And in those instances, you reply back to the new reason code with different evidence specific to that reason code. But in theory, you shouldn't see this often, but it does happen.
Right. We have just some logos down here along the bottom of some folks that we natively integrate with. And in terms of like timely responding back to the banks, responding back to the payment gateways in the exact format that they want, right? So important to be timely, pithy, context, right? Like, as with any kind of communication. So with that, we have our first poll. Love for folks to talk a little bit about, hey, our chargebacks and/or consumer abuse, would you say that's a primary concern for your organization right now? Would love trying to just kind of see if people think of this as being kind of top of mind, especially given kind of inventory management, right? Promotional abuse, like in our world, obviously, we see this all the time. We kind of live it and breathe it. I'm very curious what folks have from there. While we're doing that poll, I'm going to move forward a little bit with some quick hits of what we expect for the economy in the Cyber Week. So this is going to be U.S. focused. We have, of course, hot sales in Latin America, and all other types of holiday sales, around the world. But the results for the poll, by the way, are the vast majority say yes, chargebacks and consumer abuse are a problem and a concern for the organization. Only about 20% of folks say no, not a primary concern. So in general, I think we agree it's kind of top of mind. So what we expect here, you see a 5 and 8, an 8 and a 5. The key theme here is that we expect spend to be very modestly up. A 5% year-over-year growth is really modest for e-commerce, considering kind of what it historically has been growth-wise. We are expecting more product volume in that Cyber Week promotional period. And so what that means is we expect there to be more discounts, more people pursuing kind of like deals, right, from that perspective, but the actual spend on dollars to be, modestly lower than the products. Overall, however, we expect that to be inverted, where the kind of holiday spending period gets stretched out a little bit more across a couple months. And we expect that the spend to be slightly higher, while people then are being kind of choosy outside of the Cyber Week in terms of kind of where they're spending their money on that. Lots of people have been kind of saving up over the last 2 months, 3 months for the holidays. The consumer spend is pulled back, but consumer savings is not yet totally depleted. So that's where we expect some of that will be spent, given kind of the travel situation with Europe and all that kind of stuff. So longer period, slightly less discounts overall. And apologies, looking like my clicker is broken. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. All right. So within that spend and product volume, we have here the average order value is slowing, but people are putting more things in their baskets, right? So they're buying more items, right, of less expensive things. And so what that could mean is, hey, I'm buying, kind of instead of a full gallon of milk, I'm buying a half gallon of milk, or instead of buying the latest version of these earbuds, I'm going to buy the second gen, but I'm also going to get the second gen of maybe like a tablet pen, right? So they're buying more items that they want, but maybe not the highest end item. We're also seeing a ton of promotional activity going on. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And the discount codes. So this is just really stunning stat for me. I think almost a fifth, and in fact, a little bit more than a fifth of GMV has a discount code being applied to it. Now, I think this is really important to understand what this data means as compared to just scraping pricing. We actually know what items are being sold for, right? So it's really easy to take a look at a site or to scrape a site and say, hey, what are they offering the PS5 at? Or what are they offering this item at? we can tell you this data is what is actually being sold, and are the discounts being applied? How many dollars are having that discount being applied to them? And so promotions are getting more and more important for the kind of online retail space. How sustainable this is a question mark. I know lots of people are thinking really deeply about the promotional strategy. We bump forward one more slide. We are seeing very different worlds between the haves and have-nots in retail. The largest players have kind of consolidated and have kind of been able to kind of grow a little bit more. And then kind of there's a middle kind of SMB tier, and then there's a small business. We are, of course, seeing huge variation in each of these buckets, but generally what we've seen is that the largest players have been able to face the inventory management and the fulfillment costs and all of those a little bit better than everyone else. We bump forward one more slide. We have some verticalized predictions. So apparel, we expect to be kind of not quite as busy during Cyber Week. In general, you kind of see like a slightly over trend from that perspective. Electronics, we're seeing trending down. Sporting goods, kind of flat overall. Health and beauty, we project to be down, and home goods, we project to be about flat. So these are a combination of our data, prior year sales data, current year sales data, consulting, projections. And if you want to kind of look and see how this is playing out in real time, you can check our Pulse data, which is published, kind of live, and you can take a look at that. The last one I think is really interesting. We bump forward one more slide. Is talk a lot about like the 3-year bond yield curve as a kind of indication for the economy overall, and if it's inverted or not. This is the consumer price index, and for the red line, which is US e-commerce, and the blue line is US overall, and this is the consumer price index. So basically, how much inflation are we seeing, or how much change in price are we seeing? Not all of this is inflation, of course, but you get kind of the buzzwords that are going around. You compare the consumer price index of of overall for the US, the blue line. You see that during COVID, e-commerce was able to command higher prices than retail overall. That flipped starting about July of this year, and it has kind of plummeted down. So what that tells us is inventory management, promotions, discounts, kind of pricing strategies, a lot of things are being moved to get rid of through the online channels. And that in general is driving prices in the online channels down. And this, I think, is a really interesting one to pay attention to for profitability heading into this holiday period, of ensuring that the e-commerce businesses are able to be profitable at the prices that you have to be, given kind of the rest of the market is potentially overcorrecting, right, compared to overall retail. I think this one is a really key thing to take a look at, because we've been living for almost 2 years, right, in an inverted kind of relative curve here. So if we go forward one more slide, talk a little bit about, hey, during the holidays, first-time shoppers, they look suspicious, right? So you have to make the right decisions when you're trying to get those people who want to get a gift. Because they're getting a gift, you have shipping and billing mismatches, which look like fraud. And also then, as Doug mentioned, make it harder to win item not received, right? If it's an ABS match and a billing ship match, right? Like, you got to make sure that you have the right information for those item not received gifts. Talk about item not received. BOPIS, buy online, pick up in store, pick up at curbside, pick up at locker, return at the locker. All of these, post-fulfillment logistics or omni-channel delivery methods really overwhelm retailers that don't have a solid plan in place, but consumers love them. They love them so much, especially during the holiday period. So we've seen incredible growth of buy online, pick up in store during holiday seasons before COVID, during COVID, and we just expect that trend to continue. Last one is just, once you have all these gifts, like just for the return season. So we always joke about, well, the transaction season is, October, November, December. The return season is November, December, Jan, and the chargeback season is December, Jan, Feb. It's just wave after wave after wave of operational crush. So we expect that those peaks will continue to follow through. All right, so got our next poll. And so what kind of data are you all most interested in? So we have year-over-year volume trends. If we could bump forward a slide, that'd be great. Promotions and discounts, inventory management and logistics, or vertical specific data. So I'm very curious kind of what of those are most interesting for folks. And keep in mind, the Pulse data has all of this information, just always really helpful for us to know what's going on. Okay. We maybe bump forward one more. Our next section is going to start the crimes and cocktails piece. And so Doug's going to take us through some stories. He's going to be the expert, and I'm going to ask questions. Please, in chat, if you have questions about specific stories, feel free to ask. I think we have a good breadth of those. Given time, we're not going to go super deep, but hopefully these are some fun stories. And we really want to kind of remind everyone, this is storytelling, right? So we've caught somebody, right? They are lying. How do we convince a bank that we're right? It's just such a fun writing prompt. And so, creative writing prompt, but there's lots of strictures about what you can and can't use and all that kind of stuff. So kind of get in the headset of like, hey, I'm trying to steal something. How am I going to get caught? Or, hey, I'm an investigator, right? We need to figure out how to convince a bank about this. That's kind of the right headspace. And so we have a nice kind of even split here in terms of the types of data that folks are interested in. Volume trends, top line, right? Hey, what's going to happen with my sales? Of course, slightly leading the pack, but promos and discounts and post-fulfillment inventory management, definitely right up there. Vertical specific data is less interesting, but not by too much. So super, super good that like there's a good mix, and hopefully we're kind of covering all that. All right. So Doug, I'm not sure if you can push forward but otherwise let's get through some of these stories.
I hit it a few times, so hopefully it doesn't jump too many slides. Okay, perfect. I think we're good.
All right.
There is definitely a delay though.
No, I think we might need some assistance from the back room.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, here we go. Yeah, so for this first story, there's a lot of words on this and screenshot. I'm not going to read through all of it, but I wanted to kind of show a snapshot of some of the evidence and the detail that we would provide back to the bank, like Bennett said, to tell the story of like, this is invalid. This is somebody trying to get away with something. So if we kind of talk through this first case, this is somebody who's been buying high-end watches consistently. I think in this case, though, it was a $21,000 watch. And for some reason, they decided to charge this one back. And this person had been importing these over into Canada. And so we contacted the courier and were able to determine, one, the cardholder actually paid all of the fees for import, which were somewhat significant. You typically wouldn't see a fraudster go to that type of effort. But then on top of that, this courier also required the recipient to show their government ID. And lo and behold, of course, the recipient was the cardholder. And so it was pretty much a clear-cut case. This is not fraud. We have a very consistent history of you buying stuff like this, and B, like you signed for it. It was delivered to your house. And so we were going to that level, easily able to recover this large loss to that merchant.
Right. And so this one I think is super interesting. 22K. I mean, it's a lot of money, right? Drop that on a watch. I got to think about that one, make sure it's the right one. Do you have a sense of what the largest chargeback recovery we have ever won is?
Yeah, it's 49,000. Also right. For a watch. So this is definitely, to your point, when you sell kind of high risk items, you're going to see fraud with it, but you're also going to see abuse. And this is a really good example of what that looks like.
Yeah. For those that don't know, Signifyd also works with like gold bullion and like, collectibles. Typically, once you get into the 100K plus, you start looking at wires, which has its own separate story of like how we deal with guaranteeing those. But yeah, 50K kind of from that perspective. All right, so this one is actually fraud. And then I think we have another story that the next one.
Yes.
Yes.
So this is a great case of this is non-fraud, this is item not received, physical goods. So we should have, obviously good shipping to that, but also our use of social media and how we can, bolster our cases, not just with here's physical proof of delivery, but more to that. So this was somebody who bought a large amount of apparel, about 40 items. And so when we look this person up on LinkedIn, we see that they're an owner of an apparel store. And so we immediately kind of think, oh boy, I wonder if if they're selling these items. We went one step further and looked at the Better Business Bureau just to confirm, yes, this is the owner of this shop. And when we went to their Instagram page, this is beautiful, like the day that these items were shipped and delivered, they updated their Instagram post to show it pictures of that exact merchandise, saying, hey, look what just hit our shelves, come in and buy. And so this again helps to tell that story to the bank that, hey, not only were these delivered, but like here's photograph evidence that they posted themselves of the exact items that they say they never received. And again, this is another one of those, with that type of evidence, we have a high likelihood of recovering that money.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories about item not received is claiming that someone didn't receive an above ground pool, and it was a giant, very expensive, very nice pool, and you can see it on Google Maps, right, or Google Earth, and it's like, okay, all right. So I think that tells me just people. This is a fascinating stat that I think is relevant now. It's like, this is pretty brazen, right? At least for me, I would not be able to do this, right? I wouldn't be able to post like, hey, here's the stuff that I just got, while also claiming that I never got it. I would have trouble with that. But 18 to 22% of consumers have told us, or analysts in surveys, would you lie in order to get something for free from a retailer? 18 to 22% of people tell us, yes, we would. So I'm sure the number is actually higher of US consumers that would be willing to lie to get something for free. So it's always kind of interesting of, you do need to do investigation. You do need to have data, right? And Doug mentioned some of the data that we had that maybe somebody else wouldn't, but with just some digging, like you could win this case. Now, it's hard, it's timely, you have to package it correctly so that the bank knows how to interpret this, right? Imagine Susan, in Omaha, right, taking a look at this, like, what does she want to see, right, in terms of that information packet? But I just find that quite fascinating. So have a question. If we bump forward one slide, we have a question about digital gift cards. So I think this is a digital good, cryptocurrency. Obviously we're in the middle of a crypto winter. Chargebacks in the middle of losses on a financial asset, or whatever we want to call a crypto coin. Obviously, chargebacks go up. Maybe talk a little bit about this one, and then let's also talk about gift cards as well.
Yeah, definitely. So this is another item not received for digital good now. And so we're not going to have, it was shipped with FedEx to their front porch and they signed for it. We're going to have to find other ways to do that. And luckily, though, in the digital space, there's still quite a bit of evidence that can really paint the picture of you received this. And so for this case, this person bought $4,000 in cryptocurrency. And if we move forward, we'll be able to see that, we were able to use the KYC information they provided to ensure this is the cardholder, this is their account. And then one step further is we could then go look into their digital wallet to say, yep, that amount was definitely deposited into your wallet at the time of purchase. And not only that, but we also see that you withdrew it shortly thereafter. So you can't claim you never received it, because not only did you receive it, you accessed it and moved it. And so again, this to me is really good evidence. It's very compelling to show this person was in fact and received these goods.
Yeah, I just want to underscore how different these first few ones are, and we're just talking about like type of chargeback and like type of good a little bit, right? Doug, I just want to underscore, like, each bank and each PSP has a different format, different kind of process. So we're talking, if you sell digital gift cards and you sell like something physical and something, like digital, you're talking about needing to maintain 40, 50 something for like the major US card brands. Is that math right?
Yeah, I mean, it's you definitely have to tailor it to who you're sending it to. And we do see like there's large discrepancies in how each issuing bank handles and decides on their chargebacks. And so we do need to be very thoughtful in how we respond and what evidence we do and in what format to that point.
Got it. I think that there's a really interesting question, which I think I understand in chat, and I'm going to take a crack at it. And let's keep us honest on this. Is, hey, we're getting fraud rings purchasing $50 gift cards. They're buying them sequentially, and then they use those gift cards to buy like real things, right? And so that sounds like true financial fraud, right? Like is the way the kind of the question is being described. So there are ways to mitigate fraud, which are not to dispute them after the fact, right? Once you've gotten a fraud ring that has actually gotten through, gotten order approved, gotten the good, that's the bad square, right? In this flow chart, right? You're going to want to stop the fraud rings from being able to purchase those gift cards up front, right at the beginning. And so if we take a look at kind of like what you would dispute with fraud, it's going to be like the watch example where we have Canadian, like the Canadian buyer, they claimed fraud, but you could prove it. Hey, you actually bought this, right? So that's where you're going to be able to dispute this. Okay, let's maybe do one more example for let's skip the subscription for a moment, and let's maybe go to just Brazil as a quick highlight, Doug.
Yeah, definitely. This is a good example of how in different regions, we're able to utilize different data points to really help support our cases. And so for Brazil, we're able to use, the customer's CPF, and using a third-party tool, this PH3A, we're able to identify this cardholder, their name, address, everything that they have on file with that. And then we were able to validate that against the account they used with the merchant and the data that they used for that transaction. So in this case, we can see here's the customer's data through PH3A, and then the next slide will show it's identical and it matches to exactly what was inputted for the transaction, and they shipped exactly to that address. And so again, with that proof that we delivered the merchandise to the customer's billing and shipping address, even in this scenario, we have a signature that doesn't match Maria, but that's not as relevant because we can use that CPF data to really show this is the cardholder made the purchase and it was shipped to their address.
Right. So one more layer, if you're international, each bank not only has that, but there can be different country rules as well. So just want to kind of give a sense of the breadth of like the different variables that you can say, like, hey, does my business do digital or not? Does my business do just subscription or not? Does my business, all of those questions, you can now say, gosh, I need to have like a plan or an approach or a process for each one of those from that perspective. All right, I think we've got hopefully some fun stories. I think that if we step forward to the next poll, I'd be very curious kind of if folks have a sense of how much they lose to chargebacks. And so this is the intent of this question is more of like, hey, we think we could recover this, but we're not able to. So that could be, it's fraud that we shouldn't say yes to, right? Or it's chargebacks where consumers are disputing, but we think they're lying. We just can't win them. While we're talking about this, Doug, do you want to talk a little bit about PayPal as a financial provider and kind of like as an intermediary, and if there's anything specific about chargebacks for PayPal?
Yeah, PayPal is unique, obviously, because you're going to have two different flows of chargebacks potentially. One where it's the cardholder is filing directly with their bank. That chargeback will go to PayPal. They'll push it to the merchant. Or you have where the cardholder disputes it directly with PayPal and it becomes a claim. In both scenarios, though, you're going to provide the same type of evidence. To be honest, like we see a lot of success with PayPal. They are much more merchant friendly compared to the card networks. And so by providing the rules that they have are really similar and aligned with credit card chargebacks. So what we would provide, but we do see a higher win rate with PayPal specifically.
Yeah. So I think some of the questions that I'm seeing in chat are really like, hey, we can't seem to crack this, or we can't seem to crack this. I think part of it could be like, got to make sure that you're responding back kind of with the information, or, you have Doug and team on your side, I guess is another way to do it. All right. So in terms of sizing, I think it's really interesting that, almost 20% of people aren't sure how much they're losing on this, but this is a pretty big problem for folks. Like this is a, 7-figure problem for a lot of people, even in this chat. And you can kind of get a sense of, it's always helpful to put a dollar number on it, right? To float it to the exact level. I also think it's really important though to say like, look, this measures profitability. This measures, kind of customer experience, right? All of those like top level things are really important. Nice, I love it. So somebody says, before we used Signifyd, we lost 80K in 1 year, and now we don't, that's always fun. I'm glad to hear that. All right. So speaking of saving lots of money and making sure the customer experience is the best, I wanted to turn to hopefully like the idea of like, hey, I have digital gift cards I need to protect. I have whatever I'm like my core like retail good is, right? From that perspective, there's so many different things that people have to worry about in terms of making sure you get the answer right. So we call these things checkpoints, right? And then like account creation or account login, that's a checkpoint, right? Where you need to make sure that, hey, is this who they say they are? Is this the person who has the right to use this account or not? Right? And that's an account protection product. And then we have payments optimization, which is, hey, like, are you going to do promos? Or, how are you going to the checkout? You have to then make the right fraud decision, right? So the person asking about the gift cards, you need to make sure that whoever or whatever is making the decision to allow those digital gift cards go out, that's where you need to stop the actual true financial crime from happening. But then you get into refunds and returns and disputes, and these are your customers. And ideally, you want to keep the best customers, right? And roll out the red carpet for them, maybe even offer free returns, like all of these types of experiences that people are demanding, especially in the United States. And if you can't do that, or you can't do it in time, that's where the customer loyalty is going to drop down over time. And we see people that are able to go up to that bleeding edge of customer experience really doing well. So within each of those, Signifyd has a product, right, to kind of help with that. At the base layer of it is the commerce network. I started off saying like, hey, we work with the largest retailers in the world, the largest marketplaces in the world, and then also mom and pops, right, across all the different e-commerce platforms. And so that consortium of data helps us know like, hey, this person's lying, or hey, this person's really good. They're not going to ever steal from you, right? Like go ahead and let them do through, offer them a free refund. Don't dispute their chargeback. They actually didn't get it. We promise you, we'll guarantee it back. That's, make sure you get them to come back to you again. On top of that is machine learning. On top of that is Decision Center, which is the way for you all, the retailers, to be able to make decisions on, hey, I route this to this particular case, or you know what, I don't want to do any business in Texas unless it goes through this so that I can get better tax treatment, whatever those business policies are that you need. And then obviously reporting insights and agent consoles for each of that. So taking away kind of like 3 key things that I think that people should be thinking about ahead of the holidays is like, just do the basics, right? Like meet your shipping SLAs. Like the number one reason that we see chargebacks or abuse or complaints or cancellations or low NPS or social media blowups is like, you don't get the thing delivered when you're supposed to, right? Or you don't tell people when it's going to be delivered and you don't update them. So shipping SLAs, performance SLAs, that's the bedrock. Got to make sure that you're getting the orders through. Typically automation really helps with that, or machine learning decisioning really helps with that, or staffing up your manual review time and training them to being able to do that. Then you have to think about, okay, how am I profitably going to do promotions and free returns? And so the reason we put free returns here is like, we think this is really becoming table stakes for most categories in the US. And folks that don't have a way to think about this for their best customers are going to lose on a sale. Fully 35% of consumers say they won't come back if they have a bad returns experience once. And 75% of consumers look at the return policy before they'll make a purchase. So I think a lot of people are like, you know what, we've looked at our returns data. This is the right matrix for us. I think what they forget is how many people don't buy because of a returns policy. Consumers will read and they'll make a decision, especially if they're a first-time buyer. Last piece is that customer lifetime value, right? How do you know who the good customers are? How do you make sure that they have the best experience? How do you make sure that the new people know what the benefits of buying from you again are? We see huge impact of people kind of bundling in additional services, trying to do subscriptions, build a lifetime kind of engagement with their customer. Those types of businesses seem to be doing really well right now in e-commerce. All right, we have one final poll, and then we'll get to the questions. So what do you think some of the fraud teams or your ops teams are focused on for the upcoming holiday season? Order review is kind of like that question of, should I ship or not? Should I let those digital gift cards go through to that email account or not? Promotional strategy, discounting strategy, like trying to get the right inventory in the right hands while still making money. Is it the customer experience, or is it always the answer of this, do it all? Make the most money possible by spending the least money, and make sure everybody loves you too. All right. And we have a couple other questions kind of in the queue. So I'd love to, if now is a great time. All right. All right. So in terms of this group, I think this is super fascinating. This could be kind of a selection bias of like who wants to come to a Crimes and Cocktails kind of event. But promotional strategy is really low. That blows my mind. I think that's really interesting. But to be fair, all of the above leads with about 40%. Then customer experience and order review are tied. But I think it's really interesting that promo strategy is kind of not like being thought of on its own in this group. Super helpful. All right. All right, now for Q&A. All right, so please, if you don't have a question, let's go through. All right. Okay, I think this is a great question. So a lot of what we've talked about has been like what happens once the chargeback comes in, right? Or how to prevent a fraud type chargeback by not allowing it to be shipped in the first place. Doug, this is a good one. How can you encourage customers to contact the merchant rather than file a chargeback in the first instance? Like what policies could you do, or like talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's super important, right? Like a lot of the times chargebacks are filed because a customer can't get a hold of the merchant. And so it's making that kind of easily accessible to the customer, whether it's through your website. I know people have been just, using the descriptor and putting in the URL to get to customer service, or a phone number in the descriptor to be able to call. But I think that's definitely something that merchants need to look at. Is it hard for my customers to get a hold of our company, to our customer support? And if it is the case, then yeah, you're going to have more chargebacks that come from the customer disputes angle of it. If they didn't get the item, if they can call in and say, oh, it's on its way, it'll be there in a week, then the customer can wait. Or if it's the wrong color, like you can do a return and have that fixed. So that really is like, we encourage merchants to make that as easy as it can be. I know it's difficult at times, but it really has a huge impact.
Yeah, and those customer or abusive customer contacts, let's assume that somebody calls in. It's really helpful to help win a dispute if it does come, right?
100%. Yeah. If someone claims fraud and then we can see they've contacted customer support, like fraudsters don't do that, true customers do. And so we can use that as evidence to say, here, look, they reached out to you and tried to initiate a return. You refused because of your policy. Now they filed a fraud chargeback. That doesn't hold water.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so I think in general, the simplest things that I see people do are like put the contact information in context, right? Context, pithy communication, right? And so like on the checkout page, in the confirmation page, right? Like all those types of things I think can be very, very helpful. All right, then let's see, we have another question about if a chargeback is lost and the customer has gotten their money back. So we, the merchant, our customer, the retailer, and we think, hey, this person's lying, and we're going to try to prove it. ultimately, however, we lose. There's this next phase, right? It's called pre-arbitration. Like, what's your thoughts on pre-arbitration? Should you pursue it, or is it talk to me about that calculus?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think it depends on the merchant's risk, because if you lose at pre-arbitration, there are really large fees associated with that usually outweigh the cost of the goods. And typically the rules currently are very skewed towards cardholders. So it is hard to prove beyond a doubt and have the networks choose in your favor. So we tend to not, for the most part, but in certain cases where we have really, really good, compelling evidence and the dollar amount of the item is really high, like we'll definitely pursue it. But I think it's something you have to take on a case-by-case basis. But I wouldn't discourage it, I guess, if you feel really confident in the evidence that you have.
Right. Yeah. I think so. Someone noticed $500 arbitration fees are crap. Yes, it is. It is very expensive. Yes, this is a very expensive process. So make sure it's worth fighting over. Another question about luxury goods, I think, is an interesting one. The person says, "Hey, we sell luxury items. Oftentimes, our customers, kind of can profile as a fraudster, right? They're traveling abroad, they're using an international credit card, they're having it delivered to their hotel, or to whatever case, or all those types of examples." That to me it's a modeling question, right? It's a data modeling question for the upfront fraud decisions. And luxury goods, definitely, VIPs. I oftentimes call like the gray tribe, like people who kind of skew libertarian, want to have privacy. I've set my, I'm not me personally. These people might set their IP address to Romania for whatever reason. There's all kinds of legitimate use cases for obscuring your identity or just normal purchase behavior, depending on the order, that are going to look wrong if you don't have the right context. And so the way that our models work is they look at the product, they look at the item level, they look at the purchase history of that particular payment instrument. And you have to kind of put all of it in context in order to make the right decision. And then, of course, one more point that I want to make maybe on this one is, I oftentimes see this with luxury merchants, is they feel like they need to dispute every single chargeback because every single one of them is $10,000, right? For example, what do you say about that? Should any merchant dispute every single chargeback that comes in?
No, to be blunt, no. I think you should be selective. There's no point if it's true fraud. Like, I think, Bennett, you spoke to this earlier too, of just that customer friction of a true victim of fraud. You don't want to do that. There's fees associated with everything that we do. So even disputing, there's going to be fees for. And so I think ultimately our approach is we want to establish ourselves with a good reputation of, when we dispute something, the bank hopefully will recognize, because we're selective, we're only disputing things where we have really solid data. If you dispute everything, I think you start to lose that credibility.
Yeah, absolutely. We see the win rates or the recovery rate start to go down for folks that dispute everything. Because again, Susan in Omaha is like, oh man, another dispute that's, it's just human beings at the end of the day are making this decision. So I think it's really helpful to think about that. All right. Well, we are about at time. I really apologize for not being able to get to all the questions. It's not that it wasn't a good question, just kind of there's so many, kind of took the ones that popped out at me. I think we have some gifts for you all. Of course, again, sponsored by Card and, in partnership with Signifyd. Of course, there's a laundry list of places where we unfortunately can't ship alcohol to. Hopefully you're not in one of those jurisdictions. Really excited to kind of share this with you all, and hopefully it makes your holiday season a little bit better as you're sharing some of these stories over cocktails with your friends. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Signifyd.com/pulse has the data. And then I'm sure that, if you want to get in contact to talk with an expert or get some advice from Doug, we'd love to hear from you.